I'd like to talk a little bit today about the representations of Cuba and Cuban independence in we generally call like dime novels or westerns of the very late 19th century, published in the United States. So I'll start out just by speaking about representations of Cuba in westerns at the time. I'll focus mainly on a writer by the name of Prentice Ingram and his representations of the frontier and how they maybe can be read into his writings that include Cuba. Then I'll move to some examples from the actual stories that involve Cuba and kind of give my reading of those afterwards. So some of you who are here, or rather saw a talk I gave back at the NEH seminar, whatever it was now, a year and a half ago. Remember, I do British Lit mainly, but this kind of led me to finding a bunch of writing about Cuba in the American popular press that was, it's fiction, it's serialized novels and short stories and things like that. But they deal with Cuba fairly explicitly, and some of the locations of these things in terms of their publication might be a little, I don't know, unsuspected by, I think, readers. So I thought I would look into that this time and see what, the American Western frontier has to do with, at least in the fictional realm, has to do with Cuba and how they thought about it. So I ended up with like 3 guiding questions here. The first one is essentially, is Cuba, we call it an American frontier of some sort, either literally or theoretically? If so, how much does it align with the American West as we typically conceptualize it? How are Cuba and Cuban identity constructed? Which markers of difference are employed? And what are the literary stakes for these representations, and how might they enlighten cultural thinking about the American frontier or Cuban independence? So we see the two of them, Cuban independence and kind of the American expansionism, colliding in these stories, and I thought I would try to kind of unpack at least my own reading of them. So the author I'm going to look at today, his name is Prentice Ingram. He was a colonel in the Civil War for the Confederacy, but he did also fight in the 10 Years' War, and strangely enough, as like a filibusterer. And afterwards, he went on to publish quite a few of these, popular pulpy type of stories throughout. Mainly, there's a publication called Beatles. That was kind of the main one. But he published hundreds of these, over 300, maybe as many as 600, isn't totally known. He was active, basically for the last 30 years of the 19th century. He wrote quite a few of the Buffalo Bill series. He's probably the most famous, name that you would maybe recognize from this if you haven't really read any of these stories. The Buck Taylor series, The Masked Spy. And he has a few works that actually are dedicated to Cuba. So he spent some time in Cuba, personally, some decades prior. And then when this, the War of Independence happens there, or the Spanish-American War, he starts writing some more stories kind of related to Cuba or set in Cuba. So I'm going to look at a serialized novel today. It's in 4 parts. There's the Boy Bugler in Cuba, there's the Cowboy Clan in Cuba, the Cowboy Rescuers in Cuba, and the Texan Hustlers in Cuba. So the total, each one is about 35,000 words. So they total, if you put these into one novel or one codex, it would be like 250 to 300 words or something like that. So it's fairly substantial piece. There was going to be a 5th part, but Beatles actually, I think, went out of business like right around the time when the 5th one would have come out. So that one is kind of lost, I guess, to posterity. But the point, though, is that these 4 kind of comprise a fairly interesting case study in representations of Cuba in the very popular press. Remember, this is like mass media, very broadly disseminated, particularly for like a working class audience. So it's a bit different maybe than the newspapers that we were just hearing about. Most likely this is a less wealthy and less educated class, and also class of readers, and also younger typically. A lot of times, in British stuff like this, a lot of times they call it boys fiction or adventure fiction, but generally accepted as being, written for young males for the most part, at least with the intent of such, capturing their attention. So the culture, just a really quick background on like the frontier narrative, as we probably all know it to some extent or another, but just to kind of delve into a couple of details that are important for me. The frontier myth's been labeled as America's secular creation story. Usually depends on the expansion of American values, some national effort to tame a faraway place, promises of bounty and treasure and things like that. And also while doing all this, expressing the essential virtues of American people who explore and settle these frontiers. Number of the cultural factors in the 1890s coincide, you know, sort of give us this working class audience reading these stories that Ingram had written and then were published. And what I want to try to do today is basically try to read them allegorically rather than narratively. Try to see like what is the ideological backing that seems to be driving the action of the story, as well as maybe the constructions of the characters that we're seeing, and then how we might unpack some of that. And as I think we'll see, as I walk through these things over the next couple of minutes, it's pretty easy to find identifications with American values like republicanism and the social benefits of adventurous heroes. The iconic figure of the genre was really Roosevelt's Rough Rider, and he has a very specific profile. He was an Anglo-Saxon gentleman, cowboy par excellence, who yoked frontier heroism to overseas militarism, in the process justifying American extracontinental expansionism and extending the ideological reach of the Western. So you have Roosevelt, the very early stages, and there's an interesting side note with this that I had learned when I was reading about this stuff that I didn't know before, which is kind of my fourth point here. There's an incredible formative aspect, the whole idea of the Western in general, which I know a little bit about, but particularly with these Westerns in these, in these dime novels and in these mass-produced publications. Buffalo Bill, the Wild West show, I'm sure everyone's probably heard of him and heard of that show in one way or another. Bill Cody with his standard name, but and that's where the Rough Riders, the name comes from. What I didn't realize is that Prentice Ingram actually ghost wrote a number of Bill Cody's stories, and Bill Cody wrote them under his own name, but Ingram had actually written them, Cody published them under his own name, and Ingram had actually written them. But he also published these dime novels of a band of Texans swooping into Cuba to help with the independence movement in 1897, which was about a year before, we get the actual Roosevelt in Cuba. So it's a really strange example of life imitating art, you could call it, but you could also call it kind of like just pulling out very sensational headlines or ideas or topics, and then putting them into newspapers and working them into the, the popular imagination of the country. So if you let me just to look at a couple examples from these texts, this is one where I kind of start at the beginning, start at the end. This is the very last lines of the final installation of the fourth one, the Texas Hustlers, Texan Hustlers in Cuba. And if you take a look at this passage that concludes, this is like the whole novel, essentially, the ending of it. There's this strange anxiety about what genre we're working in. And throughout, there are at least two or three other examples of this throughout the serialization, where Prentice Ingram really steps out, of the story, so to speak, and gives us this meta commentary about how I'm doing this Cuban narrative thing. And he really is very specific about it. It's a romance of some sort, which isn't really surprising, but he's also kind of obsessed this idea of it being factual and being grounded in some type of reality that is happening right now. And that reality that is happening right now is this Cuba Libre situation. So there's this very, I would say, fairly unusual step, especially in this type of publication, for author to be concerned about that. I mean, normally these stories, even the ones that deal with kind of topical, contemporaneous situations, don't really go to these lengths to discuss like genre or something, like in such a explicit way. So that got me to sort of thinking like, okay, so what then can, what can we make of this? So one of the topics that sort of came to mind, or one of the ways I sort of decided to interpret this, is that I think we can read the Cuban independence, and maybe Maria was just speaking to this as well, with the U.S.-Mexico border newspapers, as a type of American allegory. This is just a handful of examples from this serialization, but there are many others that really go out of their way to like explain the history of the 10 Years' War, why it matters, why the independence in Cuba is important, why the Spanish are bad, like freedom, independence, liberty, all these, standard American ideals, particularly of, Western expansion, are built right into this in a very explicit and also just kind of telling way. I think what stands out to me as well is the interest in the 10 Years' War, like coming up. Like Ingram fought in it, so he has a personal stake in it of some sort, but also it keeps coming up as like a case for why the Cubans are basically good. They've been fighting for this for a long time. They're dedicated to the cause, and we should. This is something that's like as American as apple pie or something. Um, but it does create some obstacles that now have to be like dealt with. And one of them is the racial standard. And I think what you see in at least in these stories is a type of hybridity when they're talking about, well, what does it mean to be Cuban, or how do you define Cubanness? Um, you see quite a few of this, and there are a handful of others that just kind of aren't going to be in this presentation. But there's a lot of this. I'm half Cuban, I'm half American. My mother and my sister is married to this one, or blah blah blah. Like kind of going around and around with this idea that being Cuban is actually kind of like a state of mind, kind of like being American. There's this almost like an open border type concept being built into these stories that I think, again, like Maria was saying, is trying to build some type of kinship with American ideology. The Cuban social system or something kind of reflects in a similar way maybe what we might think of as being American or something. Not necessarily tied to some explicit racial category, but rather tied to a set of ideas or something like that. And I think Rai brought this up as well with the Spanish. The Spanish are incredibly villainized. There's definitely no doubt about that. And I think in these particular stories, when conversation with the publications, other standard writing, for instance, the frontier stories, the westerns, the different romances all over the world, especially those in the western part of the United States, west of the Mississippi. I think that in my reading, with the way that they're being described, the Spanish is very similar to what you would typically see of Native Americans or outlaws or something. Like they're basically really cruel and ruthless. Have like no etiquette of war or something like that. They're kind of very, very self-serving, and they have almost like a, I think Rai used the word of like monstrous or something like that. Like there's something to that where it's almost like they're unhuman. And I guess, part of this project maybe is dehumanizing them. But yeah, there's very much this concept that, we're not on the Western frontier. We don't have, Cherokees or something, but we do have these Spanish, and we can kind of plug them in as representative of that style of governing and interactions. I think just kind of, bring some of these things to a head of some sort. There are a few ideas about the generic and geographic assumptions involve these Cuba stories that I think can be important for American literature and general conceptions of the West. One of them is that, the pursuit of freedom seems to mark the Cubans as acceptable and admirable. This dedication of liberty, as well as a willingness to engage in a long, intense fight with an imperial power, vouch the Americanness of the Cubans. And kind of in turn, it's almost like the Cubans are some type of reflection of American ideals, as they think back on their own history of, rebelling from the British and then sort of establishing themselves as like this young upstart country. Also, I don't know if anyone caught it. I probably should have pointed out when the slide was up, but there is mention once or twice very explicitly that Cuba will become a state, at the end of it once they pull away from Spain. Stories I would say are less frontier narratives, which I was expecting, and more like kind of a homestead or expansionist narrative, where settlers or pioneers have already built social bonds, and the area is primed to absorb more Americans and American values. And they also generate really classic American tension, the border between the individual and the community. On the one hand, these Texan hustlers are very much joined to each other, they'll die for each other, all kinds of stuff like that. But at the same time, there's this very strict hierarchical structure and the idea that every one of them is important, and they're individuals that are also expressing their their desires or something like that. So you get that, and that seems to be very translatable, or at least for Ingram, onto Cuban society. The modified generic and racial categories revise the American historical imagination as regards frontier settlements and contemporaneous ideas on race. Whether consciously or not, Ingram models a type of multiculturalism of the American frontier, if you want to call it that. in sort of some strange way, Ingram, always very dedicated, I'd say, certainly to like classical American values, does actually sort of make this backdoor case for like, well, Cuba is just like America, and because it's just like America, we have to be more accepting of them, even though Spanish may be the dominant language or whatever. There's kind of this strange like multiculturalism built into Cuba as a frontier zone or whatever you call it. And then finally, the stories illustrate some of the complexities of American expansionism and challenge deeply rooted assumptions regarding the relations between linearity, ethnicity, myth making, and individualism. Like the American frontier didn't just stop at California or the Pacific Ocean or something. Like there's this idea that has to go on. So where is it going to go next? I mean, Cuba seems to be like a location where that's seemingly being primed, and it didn't exactly go that way. But nevertheless, this popular writing, due to its popularity and the prolific nature of these stories, seems to speak to a very common idea at the time that was an expectation. And here's just one final image. This is Buffalo Bill's Wild West. This is pre actual Teddy Roosevelt Rough Riders. One of the flyers or advertisements for his show. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you very much.